Now, we've been in the part of the Old Testament as we do this brief skimming the surface survey, Israel's history in the monarchy period, which means the time that they had kings. And we noticed that after the first 3 kings, Israel had a little bit of a civil war and divided into 2 nations, each with its own set of kings. There was the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. Judah had 2 of the 12 tribes. The northern part, which was the kingdom of Israel, had 10 tribes. At last time, we finished up Hezekiah. And if you remember, in Hezekiah's time, the Assyrian army came, and through 2 deportations, and by that I mean they came into the land, the kingdom of Israel, all that blue area up there, and they grabbed the people and they said, "You ain't living here anymore." And they scattered those 10 tribes among all of the nations in that area of the world, and we call that, we don't know what happened to them. History does not record what happened to those 10 tribes, so we can't keep track, and it's known as the 10 lost tribes. So that blue area, as of our survey of the Old Testament, now belongs to the Assyrian Empire. It is no longer Israel. So all we've got left of God's people is the kingdom of Judah in the yellow area. Now you remember they each had their set of kings. Does anybody remember who the worst king of Israel was? Ahab. That's right. Ahab was the worst. He married a lovely girl named Jezebel. And Jezebel was a Baal worshiper. And she said, "Hey, I'm going to convert all of Israel." And she had a kind of an in-your-face Baal worship. You either comply or you get killed, because she was killing the prophets of God and she was magnifying Baal. Now, who was the worst king that we've discussed so far on Judah's side? Does anybody have any ideas? Well, we haven't discussed him yet. I think it was Hezekiah's father, who was Ahaz. He was just a really, really, really bad guy. And his son, Hezekiah, was, as of his time, the very best king that the kingdom of Judah had. He was just a great guy. But this week, we're going to look at somebody who was worse than Ahaz, even worse than Ahab on the other side, and that's King Manasseh. And let me tell you how bad King Manasseh was, and that God did not forget all the damage that he did. Manasseh ruled for 55 years. And 50 years after he died, now imagine that's a span of about 100 years here, God says this through the prophet Jeremiah as the Babylonian king Nebuchadnezzar is about to come over and remove Judah from the land. Jeremiah says, "Then the Lord said to me, though Moses and Samuel stood before me, yet my heart would not turn toward this people." Now, what's significant about Moses and Samuel? They were interceders. Why was Israel not productive in the mission that God gave them to go in and conquer the land of Canaan when they came out of Egypt? Because they had grumblers, complainers. We don't like this. We don't like hardships. This is the way we think it ought to be. And they blamed who? They blamed God, and they blamed God's leadership, Moses. And God said, fine. Wander around for 40 years. And for 40 years, what did Moses do? He interceded for these people. God, please don't destroy them. Please don't destroy them. Samuel, on a smaller scale, they rejected his leadership and said, give us a king. And he was very discouraged, and God had to cheer him up, saying, they really haven't rejected you, Sammy. They have rejected me. But Sammy says, God forbid that I should sin and cease praying for you. So Samuel was an interceder for the people, even though they had rejected his leadership. And God says, even though both of these guys stood before me, it still isn't going to make any difference for my plans for Judah. Send them out of my sight and let them go. And when they ask you, hey, where are we supposed to go? You shall say to them, thus says the Lord, those who are for pestilence. What's pestilence? I'll give you an example. COVID-19. That's a pestilence, okay? For those who are going to die by the sword, to the sword. For those who are going to die by starving to death, famine, then to famine. And for those who are designated for captivity, to be taken out of Judah and taken over to Babylon, then to captivity. And I'm going to appoint over them 4 kinds of destroyers, says the Lord. The sword to slay, the dogs to tear, the birds of the air, and the beasts of the earth to devour and to destroy. And I will make a horror to all the kingdoms of the earth because of what Manasseh, the son of Hezekiah, king of Judah, did in Jerusalem. He was so bad that if there was any chance that God might change his mind and say, no, I don't think I'm going to send Judah into captivity, Manasseh changed God's mind. All right, let's discuss this guy. He was 12 years old when he began to reign. Anybody in here 12 years old? Yeah, I thought so. Imagine being the king of Judah, or the queen of Judah. I'm sorry, sweetie. At 12 years old. You know, when I used to be a substitute teacher, you know what my favorite age group was? It was 5th grade through 8th grade. You know, about 10 years old through 14. You know, even though they're rowdy and somewhat rebellious because they're kind of trying to discover who they are and how they relate in the world, they are still easily influenced. Sometimes easily influenced by a bad leader, sometimes by a good leader. Obviously, Manasseh's really good father, Hezekiah, had no influence over this boy whatsoever. And he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. His mom's name was Hephzibah. I hope somebody names one of my grandchildren Hephzibah. I just like saying that word. And he did what was evil in the sight of the Lord, according to the abominable practices of the nations whom the Lord drove out before the people of Israel. Now let me review. Who did the Lord drive out? The Canaanites. Why did he drive the Canaanites out and give that land to the people of Israel? Because they were so very evil. None of them worshiped the Lord God. And they worshiped all kinds of gods, and most of their worship was sexual in nature. Those gods wanted them to have sex, and that pleased the gods. And man, hey, that would make a really popular religion. And not only that, some of those gods required that you take your children and you throw them in the fire. And God says, that's polluting the land. I'm going to drive them out and give you that land. However, if you start behaving like them, I'm going to throw you out of the land too. And he's already done this with the northern kingdom, Israel. All right. So it says he did what was evil. For he rebuilt the high places which Hezekiah, his father, had destroyed. He's undoing all the good that Hezekiah had done. And he erected altars for Baal. Now, folks, this just doesn't make any sense. Anytime there seems to be a contest that involves the god Baal and Yahweh, Baal comes out looking real stupid. How many of you guys remember the story of Gideon? Gideon was this shy little guy who was always hiding because he was afraid of being attacked by the Midianites and all that sort of thing. And God appeared to him, and he says, Gideon, I want you to tear down your father's altar to Baal. And Baal's so scared of his daddy and the townspeople, because they all worship there at that altar, that he does it at night. And everybody, people are going to find out. And everybody gets up the next morning, and they show up at his daddy's house, and they say, bring out your son. We're going to kill him because of what he did. But daddy says this: if Baal's such a tough guy, this is a paraphrase, let him contend for himself. Let him do something about it. And he didn't do anything. He didn't come through because he doesn't exist. Fast forward a couple hundred years, and we got Elijah on Mount Carmel. 450 prophets of Baal. Hey, if Baal is a really great God, then he's not going to have any problems calling fire down on your sacrifice, your bull over here. And if Yahweh, my God, is any kind of God, then he'll do it to my sacrifice. So let's see who comes through. Does Baal come through? No, he ends up looking stupid. And yet people keep going back to Baal worship. Why? Because you can have sex and worship Baal. It makes you feel good. You know, there are people that go to churches in the area because it makes them feel good. All right. And he made an Asherah, a place to worship the Queen of Heaven, just as Ahab, Manasseh is being compared to the worst king of Israel, just as Ahab, king of Israel, had done, and worshiped all the host of heaven and served them. And he built altars in the house of the Lord. What's that? That's the temple. You know, the place where God said, in Jerusalem, I'm going to put my name. Who else's name is now in the temple? Baal, Asherah, any other god. And he built altars for all the host of heaven in the two courts of the house of the Lord. Come on in. We got something for everybody. You want to worship Baal, the Queen of Heaven, the sun, the moon, the stars. Just pick a star. We got something for everybody right here at the temple. Come one, come all. And he burned his son as an offering. Now, Jesse, let's just say you decided to burn Jacob as an offering. Okay, man. How do you think Austin's going to feel? Am I next? You know? Imagine how Manasseh's other children felt about their daddy. I think they probably kept their distance. So he not only burned his son as an offering, he practiced soothsaying. So that's soothsaying. You know what that is? That's fortune telling. And augury. Do you know what augury is? This is, you're going to love this. People will tell you whether it's a good time to get married or go into battle or make a wise decision, but based on the movements of birds. You know what we call them? Bird brains. That's what augury is. And he dealt with mediums, not extra large, but mediums. What do mediums do? They consult the dead. They've got spirits that pretend to be your lost loved ones, and they'll tell you what's going to happen in your life. They're demons. And wizards, people who practice magical spells. He did much evil in the sight of the Lord, provoking him to anger. So you think the Lord's going to put up with this? Manasseh seduced Judah. That means the people of his country. And the inhabitants of Jerusalem, so that they also did more evil than the nations whom the Lord destroyed before the people of Israel. And the Lord, being very patient, spoke to King Manasseh and to his people through prophets, but they did not listen. Has anybody ever come to you with Scripture and said, this is wrong? How did you respond? Therefore the Lord brought upon them the commanders of the army of the king of Assyria, who took King Manasseh with hooks. I'll show you a picture of that in a minute. and bound him with fetters of bronze and brought him to Babylon. And there he is. They put a hook in your nose and they attach a chain to it. He's probably got fetters of bronze on his hands and on his feet. And they did not put him in a chariot to bring him from Jerusalem to Babylon. He had to walk, and you have to be really careful about how you walk, because if that hook comes out of your nose, it's not going to be pretty. And you look at the mean faces on those Assyrians. Let me tell you about these Assyrians. They are the original terrorists. Before they came to a town or a theater near you, word spread as they approached your city of all the people that of what happened in the towns that they had come to. First they take the men. And if they don't just outright kill them, they take a pole, put it up their butt so it comes out their mouth, and they plant them by the side of the road so everybody can see them die in agony very slowly. This makes people very afraid. While they rape their wives in front of them and steal their daughters, and they dash their children on the rocks in front of them. Folks, is that the kind of army that you want coming to the United States to conquer us? The Assyrians were the masters of terror. They were not nice at all. When the Babylonians come in, you're going to find that they are a much nicer people. But the Assyrians were not so. And they were brutal. And they were brutal to King Manasseh. They afflicted him. Now, just to give you an idea, you see where Judah is over there in the lower left-hand corner? Jerusalem is there, and that's where Manasseh ruled. And you see where Babylon is over on the bottom right corner. That's 500 miles as the crow flies. But they didn't go in a straight line. They followed the river system up to the northeast and back down, and this walk for poor Manasseh was probably about 1,200 miles or maybe more. That gives you a lot of time to think about your life and your relationship to the Lord. So how does this guy respond to God's affliction? When he was in distress, Manasseh entreated the favor of the Lord his God and humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers. He prayed to him, and God received his entreaty and heard his supplication and brought him again to Jerusalem into his kingdom. Now, I don't know how God did that. The Bible doesn't say how he got freed from the Assyrians, but God preserved his kingship so that when he got back to Jerusalem, he was still king. And then we have this statement of conversion. Look for these as you go through the Old Testament. I've pointed out a number of these. Then Manasseh knew that Yahweh was God. Think about the implications of that. Manasseh had made in Jerusalem, even at the temple of the Lord, available to worship any kind of deity that you could think of or invent, because he thought all of them were real. And now he knows that only Yahweh is real. Does he start to serve God? Is there a change in his life as we would expect of somebody who is converted? Well, let's find out. When he gets back to Jerusalem, he built an outer wall for the city of David west of Gihon in the valley, and for the entrance to the fish gate, and carried it around Ophel, and raised it to a very great height. He also put commanders of the army in all the fortified cities of Judah. Now, previously, kings had done this because they were expecting to go to battle. Manasseh never had to go to battle. No armies were threatening him. Why did he do this? Because I think he was so caught up in his own pleasures and his own passions that he had simply neglected the army and the protection of his country. So he decides to do what is right, and he continues here. And he took away the foreign gods, and the idol from the house of the Lord, and all the altars that he had built on the mountain of the house of the Lord and in Jerusalem, and he threw them outside the city. He also restored the altar of the Lord and offered upon it sacrifices of peace offerings and of thanksgiving. Now, what's he done so far? He did what his father Hezekiah did. When Hezekiah first took over as king, he got rid of the false worship and he reinstituted true worship at the temple of God. Now, I want you to notice something about those sacrifices. It says peace offerings and thanksgiving. Those are not required sacrifices. Those are voluntary sacrifices that people do because you feel good and blessed by Yahweh. And you say, I want to honor him with a peace offering or a thank offering. And the third thing he did was what all the kings should do, is he commanded the people of Judah to serve Yahweh, the God of Israel. And so Manasseh slept with his fathers, and they buried him in his house, and Amon his son reigned in his place. What does the story of Manasseh teach us? First of all, and take this very seriously, folks, because there were times when I did not take this seriously and just thought, well, you know, God's let me continue in this sin for years, and he's not going to do anything about it. God does not put up with our nonsense forever. I promise you, one day, the shoe will drop, the hammer will fall. God does not put up with our nonsense forever. A lot of people think, you know, God's patience never ends. He is always forgiving. You remember the song by the McGuire sisters. That's the name of the song. One of the lines, though it makes him sad to see the way we live, he'll always say, I forgive. No, one day, God says, I have had enough of your nonsense, and this he did with Manasseh. And when Manasseh's affliction came, or when our affliction comes from the Lord, we have a choice. We can stubbornly dig in our heels. Does anybody remember a king that did that in a real obvious way? You know, King Asa ruled for 41 years, and he was such a good king. And about 15 years into his reign, he was threatened by a 1 million man army from Africa. And he turned to the Lord. Lord, I need your help. And the Lord helped him, and he defeated that 1 million man army. Okay? Another 20 years goes by, and a smaller army comes up and threatens him. And instead of turning to the Lord and trusting him, he turned to an evil, godless nation. And so God sent a prophet to Asa, because Asa's been a good king, gives him a chance to repent. And he says, you know, you shouldn't be trusting, you should be trusting the Lord. And Asa locks him up in prison, says, I'm going to do what I want. And so God afflicts him further. And in the 39th year of his reign, Asa was diseased in his feet. And his disease became very severe. It killed him 2 years later. And yet, even in his disease, he still didn't seek the Lord, but he sought help from physicians. Friends, if you've got issues in your life, there are sins that you just keep repeating over and over again, and you can't seem to escape slavery from it. Does God promise delivery from that? Does he give us solution in the scripture? Okay. Are you a slave to bad habits or fear, anxiety, and things like that? Are those things that God has said, this is the solution? I promise it and guarantee it, and yet you have turned to something else as a solution for these things instead of trusting the Lord? Then you are no different than King Asa, and you are just going to become more and more miserable. Trust the Lord. If the Lord has said in his word, I can and will fix this if you do this, then trust him. Trust him because he can and he will, and he loves to show himself strong in situations like that. Here comes the worst part. God says in Psalm 81, I gave them over to their stubborn hearts to follow their own counsels. Friends, when your solution for your spiritual issue starts to make more sense than God's word, then you know what has happened? He has given you over to your stubborn heart, and your counsel makes more sense than his counsel. Don't let it go that far. We can stubbornly dig in our heels, or we can, like Manasseh, humbly entreat his favor. The psalmist says, before I was afflicted, I was going astray. And so God had to intervene with affliction. And you know the author of Hebrews says in chapter 12 that the Lord does discipline. He spanks those whom he loves. Why? Because he's a good father. And if he doesn't spank you, that means he doesn't love you because you're not one of his children. Paul says it this way in 1 Corinthians chapter 11. If he didn't afflict us, then we're just illegitimate children. But he does, because he loves us, and we must learn to take that as from a father's hand. Before I was afflicted, I went astray. But it was good for me that I was afflicted, that I might learn your statutes. Asa did not. Manasseh did. What is your attitude? When God afflicts you, and it's obviously his discipline because you have persisted in some way of life that displeases him, can you say, it is good that I was afflicted? That should be our testimony. You remember that song we sang this morning? Help me, Lord, when toil and trouble meeting, ere to take as from a father's hand. Recognize it as the loving discipline of the Lord in trying to correct us and set us back on the right path. What else do we learn? God loves humility and godly sorrow. Is there a sorrow that's not godly sorrow? You betcha. Paul says to the Corinthians, as it is, I am rejoicing, not because you were grieved, not because you were sorry that you sinned, but because you were grieved into repenting, for you felt a godly grief, a godly sorrow. So, what's the difference between sorrow because, you've been caught in sin and everybody disapproves of what you've done, so you feel bad? What is the difference between that kind of sorrow and godly sorrow? It's repentance. It's, I ain't doing that no more. Repentance is a change of mind about what I've been doing. Nope, not happening anymore. I was walking this way, now I'm going to be walking this way. All right? I can remember when I was a paper boy, and I'd be walking up a street, and there was a dog that used to give me trouble. And if he was out, I wouldn't be walking this way anymore. I'd be walking this way. All right? That's what godly sorrow produces. And that's the difference between just being sorry and godly sorry. The sacrifice acceptable to God is a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. God, you will not despise. What else do we learn? God can and will forgive the worst of the worst. This should be of great comfort to us, because there are lots of people that are so sorry about the mess that their lives are in, and they have said to me, and you've probably heard these testimonies, but I've done such and such. How could God ever forgive me? I've taken the life of my child in an abortion, and the guilt is just too much. I've been immoral. I've been a thief. I've spent time in prison, but God can and he will forgive the worst of the worst. Paul says this, the saying is sure and worthy of full acceptance, that Christ Jesus came into the world to save good people. Doesn't say that, does it? He came into the world to save sinners, and not just mild sinners, but really, really, really bad sinners. How bad? Even the worst. And Paul says, and I am the worst. I am the foremost of sinners. But I received mercy for this reason, that in me, as the worst, the foremost of sinners, Jesus Christ might be displaying his perfect patience for an example to those who were to believe in him for eternal life. Now, I have heard pastors say, this should be our attitude, every one of us, that we are the worst of sinners. No, that does not just do justice to the text. It just does not work, because if Paul is not the worst of sinners, because he persecuted the church of God, which is the bride of Christ, and folks, you persecute my wife, you're going to see some side of me that you do not want to see. And that made Paul the worst of sinners. How could he be an example? And people get to say, well, if God can forgive Paul, then he might forgive me too. Paul was the worst, and he was an example that God can and will forgive the worst of the worst. And who was the worst of the worst that we've been looking at today? King Manasseh. And he did. He did. What Manasseh did before his conversion was so bad that God said, I'm just going to take him out of the land. And God didn't take that bad. That's how bad it was. But personally, on a personal level, God forgave Manasseh and had mercy on him. You remember the story of the prodigal son? The young boy, he's at home and he doesn't like the rules and he doesn't like the responsibility. And he wants to be able to do what he wants to do. And just like every teenager thinks or even says out loud, I can't wait until I'm 18 and get out of this house and I can do what I want. Well, this guy doesn't wait, and he goes to his father and he says, give me the share of the property that falls to me. And his father divided the living between them, that is, this kid and his older brother. And not many days later, the young son gathered everything he had, and he took his journey into a far country, and he squandered his property in loose living. Loose living is this way of saying this kid was terribly, terribly immoral, involved in sexual sins. But he comes to his senses because God afflicted him. I will arise and go to my father, and I will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I no longer am worthy to be called your son. Treat me as one of your hired servants. Anybody who comes to God, who thinks that he's worthy of being forgiven, is on shaky ground. He has not come to God. We are not worthy. The older son thinks he's worthy. The younger son says, no, I am not worthy. And how does the father respond to this? He says, you're darn right. It's going to be years before you earn my trust. And I'm going to start you at the bottom of the ladder, and you're going to slop hogs for a while. And I'm going to make sure that you're reminded every day of how bad you were. Just think about what you've done to your mother and me. All these years of agony, wondering whether you're even alive or not. How could you have done this to us? But while the boy was yet at a distance, his father saw him and had compassion, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. Bring quickly the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and shoes on his feet. Bring that fatted calf and kill it, and let us eat and make merry. For this my son was dead and is alive again. He was lost and he's found. And they began to make merry. And that's how you treat a servant, right? No. But I want to point out a couple of instances of this word. Make merry. The Father is rejoicing. In that same chapter, in Luke chapter 15, Jesus says this: just so I am telling you that there is joy, there is rejoicing before the angels of God over one sinner who repents. And I have heard Christians and preachers for years use this verse to say, every time somebody repents before God, the angels rejoice. The angels are not rejoicing. Somebody is rejoicing in front of the angels, and I'll explain the significance of that in a minute. And who is it? It's God, the Father. And when we turn from our wickedness and we come to him with humble hearts, begging for his forgiveness, not because we think we're worthy of it, but because he offers it, I imagine God getting up off of his throne and just doing a little dance of delight in front of the angels who don't understand. The Bible says that. Peter tells us that the things that have now been announced to you by those who preach the good news to you through the Holy Spirit, things into which angels long to look. Who is a greater creation? Who is a higher form of life? We or the angels? It says in Psalm 8, what is man that you are mindful of him? Why do you think about him? Why are you paying any attention to him, God? Because you have created him lower than the angels. Angels are a higher form of life. Did God provide salvation or redemption for any angel when he sinned? No. Those angels that have sinned with Satan, they are lost and gone forever. There is no redemption. And God, we don't disagree with you. We're going to worship you anyway, but the good angels look down and say, God, why? I mean, that'd be like me saying, God, why did you die on a cross for a squirrel, but not for us humans? Angels, they understand this intellectually, but they can't wrap their head around this, and frankly, people, neither can I. We sing in the song, Crown Him with Many Crowns. When hymns were theologically correct, crown him the Lord of love, behold his hands and side. They're talking about Jesus. What happened to his hands? Nails. What happened to his side? A spear. Rich wounds, yet visible above, where he has ascended to God the Father, in beauty glorified. Now stop and think about that for a second. Some of you have scars. Some of you have scars from surgery. Some of you have scars from accidents. You're going to die, most of you, and lie in the ground. And one day the Lord is going to call you up out of the earth, or he's going to call your body up, and you're going to have a resurrected body. You know what's going to happen to your scars? All of your moles and birthmarks and imperfections? They're going to disappear. And the Lord of the universe is up there with imperfections, with a resurrected body as an eternal reminder of what it cost him to pay for my sin. No angel in the sky can fully bear the understanding of that sight. Why, Lord? You are so much greater than they, and yet you stand here for all eternity with these imperfections. But downward bends his wondering eye, talking about the angel, at mysteries so bright. What, my friends, are those mysteries? It's us. It's us. We are the mysteries of what God has done for us and not for angels. And not only that, God has forgiven us because he paid for our sins on that cross. But he is with us and he dwells in us. A mystery, the hope of glory. God can and will forgive the worst of the worst. But you've got to make up your mind about what kind of church Oak Grove is going to be. Because people will wander in here who have an immoral past, who have been guilty of the murder of abortions. And there are people in our congregation who are guilty of both of those. And I'm not going to name any names. And what is your attitude? Are you going to communicate by your life and your language about how you respond to these people that, oh no, we're not forgetting? You know why? Because we've never done that. What are they communicating about the God of grace and God of mercy? Whose grace is more than sufficient, whose grace covers some of our sins, whose grace is greater than all of our sins. And we have got to be constantly assuring one another and anybody else who comes in here that God treats us like the Father in the story of the prodigal son. And we're going to treat you the same way. Because we've got that older son. Now remember, in this parable, who does the Father represent? God the Father. Who does the Son represent? The awful, awful, worst of the worst sinners. And who does the older sin represent? The scribes and Pharisees, before whom Jesus was telling this parable, who looked down upon other sinners and said, God can't possibly love or receive them. I've never done anything like that. Behold, these many years I have served you, and I've never disobeyed your command. I never did that sort of thing. And yet you never gave me a kid that I might make merry with my friends. But this son of yours, not this brother of mine, but this son of yours came, who has devoured your living with harlots, that's immoral people, and you kill for him the fatted calf. We must guard against ever having that attitude at Oak Grove. True repentance reveals itself in lasting change. Did it reveal itself in lasting change in Manasseh's life? It sure did. There is no evidence in the scriptures that Manasseh departed from his worship of the true God. If anyone is in Christ, he really is a new creation. The old has passed away, and behold, the new has come. He has different passions. He has different pastimes. The true believer talks about different things, and he pursues different things in life. And even if you haven't had this miraculous, great testimony conversion of once I was all messed up on drugs, now I'm all messed up on God, at least your life doesn't resemble the pursuits and passions of people who do not know the Lord. Your life is a new creation. You are different. And Jesus says you will know them by their fruits. Are grapes gathered from thorns or figs from thistles? So every sound tree bears good fruit, but the bad tree bears evil fruit. The sound tree cannot bear evil fruit, nor can a bad tree bear good fruit. Every tree that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. Thus you will know them by their fruits. And Christian after Christian says, who are you to judge? Because only Jesus really knows who's converted or not. Is that what Jesus says? Jesus says you will know them by their fruits. Folks, if anyone is in Christ, he is a new creature. He is not perfect. And it is not the perfection of his life that we're looking for, but the direction of his life. So keep that in mind as you think about this wonderfully merciful God who forgives the worst of the worst and has demonstrated his mercy in the life of King Manasseh. We have only one more king to discuss, and then we're done with that period of Israel's history. Thank you for being faithful, and we'll resume next week.